Hello, Brobs. We're back with Black Folktales by Julius Lester. This is the second tale, Why Apes Look Like People. For a long time after the Lord created the world, the only creatures on it were the animals. They swam the rivers, climbed the mountains, flew through the air, and lived their lives. They learned who to fear and who to greet as a friend, and they followed the fortunes and misfortunes of the seasons and the years, each day flowing from the one previous and toward the one to come. One day the deer family was drinking at the lake at the time of the day when the sun seems to stop at the top of the sky. Suddenly a loud noise caused the air to tremble, and the youngest deer fell at the water's edge, a trickle of blood coming from its side. Frightened, the other deer ran to the safety of the woods, except for the oldest child. He too was frightened, but his curiosity was so strong that he returned to the edge of the forest, and there hid behind a tree to see if the loud noise was going to be repeated or if anything else was going to happen. He had scarcely hidden himself when an animal he had never seen came down to the lakeside. It was a horrible-looking creature. It walked on two legs and had no hair, except for a little on its small round head. The deer had never heard of such an animal. He couldn't even remember his cousin, the moose, ever talking about such an animal, and the moose would surely have seen such a creature, for he often went up into the high mountains and had seen many strange things. The creature carried a long piece of wood in one of its paws. It stooped down, laid the piece of wood to one side, and magically began taking the skin off his younger brother with something it clutched in its paw. The deer's fright became stronger than his curiosity, and he turned and bolted to the forest to tell his father what he had seen. The father found it hard to believe what his oldest son told him. He had lived a long time, had talked to many animals, and had been many places. He had never heard of any creature such as this. The next day, however, the father repeated the story to every animal he met. None of them had heard of such an animal either. Several weeks passed. The deer family found the new lake to drink from, and they had almost put the incident out of their minds when, late one afternoon, while resting in a grove of shady trees, the father overheard two birds talking. "Did you hear what happened this morning?" "You mean about the robin family?" the second bird responded. "Yes, everybody's been talking about it. One of the robins was flying home after spending the morning with a sick relative, I heard. Suddenly there was a loud noise, and he fell out of the sky like a dead limb dropping from a tree." "That's exactly what I heard," the first bird said. "What do you think happened?" "Well, it sounds to me like he had a sudden attack of some sort. You know, this time of year, you have to be careful just what kind of worms you eat. He could have eaten some bad worms, and that could have caused a sudden attack of some kind." "Maybe so, but I've never heard of anything like that happening before." "Well, that's true. And I heard that after the loud noise, he started bleeding." "Bleeding?" The father deer could contain himself no longer, and he excitedly told the birds what had happened to his youngest child. He described the strange animal his oldest son had seen, but the birds could give him no clue as to what it might be. They promised, however, to keep a sharp eye out for such a creature. They covered many miles in the course of a day and saw many things. In fact, they told him that they would give the description to all the other birds, and without a doubt, if such a creature really existed, one of the birds would see him sooner or later. Hardly a day had passed when the hawk happened to see just such an animal near the lake where the young deer had been killed. The hawk wanted to get a closer look at the creature, and although the hawk knew what had happened to the young deer and the bird, the hawk knows no fear. So he folded back his wings and dropped from the sky into a tall tree from which he could observe the new animal. He watched the animal most of the day and saw it take wood and create a fire. This creature could do what the lightning could do when it struck a tree during a storm. The creature then took a large piece of meat and placed it on the wood, which was turning black. After the meat had turned black, the creature took it out of the fire and began eating it. The hawk had seen enough, and spreading his great wings, he went to tell others what he had seen. By this time, other animals in other parts of the forest had begun to tell stories about a creature who walked on two legs and had no hair. And when the news brought by the hawk began to spread, no one doubted any longer that a new animal was living among them. For many days, the animals talked among themselves, wondering what kind of animal it was that talked to no other animal and considered all animals its enemy. Finally, the rabbit sent word through the forest that all the animals should send a representative to a meeting to discuss the situation. The other animals agreed that the rabbit always did have good ideas, and the next evening, as the sun was setting, a group of them met in the deepest part of the forest. Well, I think everybody knows why we're here, the rabbit began. Anybody have any ideas? There was a long silence. Finally, the frog spoke. Well, Mr. Rabbit, we never had a problem like this. That's right, the elephant added. This new animal don't obey no rules. There doesn't seem to be anybody he likes. The other animals muttered in agreement, but no one had any suggestions. They thought for a long while. Mr. Rabbit, the snake asked, you're a better talker than the rest of us. Maybe if you went and talked to him and explained to him how things are, maybe he'd change his ways. That's not a bad idea, the mouse added. He is new around here, the fish commented. He probably just doesn't know any better. All the animals thought it was a good idea. So early the next morning, the rabbit went down to the lake to talk to the new animal and explained to him all the rules and regulations they'd worked out for living with one another. Unknown to the rabbit, the hawk, high in the sky, had decided to follow him. The hawk didn't like the rabbit, but he still didn't like the idea of the rabbit going to meet the new animal alone. He thought all of the animals had to protect each other until they learned who and what this new animal was. After that, they could go back to doing as they pleased. The rabbit hadn't been at the lake for more than a few minutes when he saw the new animal. He hopped over to him. Before he could get a word out of his mouth, the creature snatched him up into his arms. Its arms. The rabbit tried to squirm away, but the creature squeezed him tighter. With his keen eyes, the hawk saw everything, and he fell like a bolt of lightning to the earth. As he neared the strange creature, he gave a loud shriek, stretched his legs, bared his talons, and dug them into the creature's shoulders. The creature screamed and dropped the rabbit. The hawk picked the rabbit up quickly, remembering not to dig his talons too deeply into the rabbit's body, and was back into the upper reaches of the sky before the creature's screams had died. That night, the animals held another meeting at which the rabbit and the hawk reported what had happened. The animals quickly concluded that they couldn't risk sending anyone else to hold a conference with the new animal. So what do we do now? The deer asked. Kill him, the rabbit exclaimed. Mr. Lion, you're always roaring like you're the baddest thing around. You go get him. The lion shook his head. One of my cousins tried to fight him, and the creature has a stick that spits fire and kills. That's how my cousin was killed. Seems to me that Mr. Hawk did a pretty good job of saving your life today. Yeah, Mr. Hawk, what about you? The other animals asked all at once. You can do it. The hawk thought it over for a while. He didn't like the idea. He much preferred soaring in the upper reaches of the air, away from everyone. He really didn't like being around other animals or even being too close to the ground. In fact, if he could have had his way, there would have been food in the air for him to eat, so that the only part of the earth he'd ever have to touch would be the top of a mountain. Once or twice a week, he was able to snatch a bird out of the air, but too often he had to come right down to the ground to get food, and he didn't like it too much, so he declined. He'd done all he was going to do. Somebody else had to do something new. Now. The other animals were angry, but the hawk wouldn't change his mind. The animals continued to argue with him, and after a few minutes he simply spread his wings and sending a cool breeze over them, he flew back to where the clouds lived. The animals spent a good hour cussing the hawk before they calmed down enough to continue with the meeting. After several hours, they decided that part of their problem was that they didn't know what kind of animal it was. If they knew, it might give them some idea what to do. So they decided that the next morning, the rabbit, the deer, and the frog would go up to heaven to see God. If anybody knew, God had to know. It was late morning when they got to heaven, but God was just waking up, and he couldn't see them until he had finished his coffee. The Lord gets kind of grouchy if he doesn't have a cup of coffee in the morning, so they sat on the porch and waited. Finally, the Lord came out. Well, 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 he said, sitting down in his rocking chair. It's been a long time since any of you have been up here. Must be something wrong. He chuckled. I think the last time you brought a delegation up here, Mr. Rabbit, was when you got that petition together asking me to stop wintertime. The rabbit smiled sheepishly. Well, I've gotten used to that, Lord. Didn't I tell you you would? I hope everything's all right now. Well, Lord, to tell you the truth, everything's not all right. What's the matter? You got plenty of water, don't you? Water's fine, Lord, but plenty tree leaves to munch on for snacks? Plenty tree leaves, Lord. The thing is, ain't there enough oxygen in the air? I'll have to admit that it took me a while to find just the right amount of oxygen to put in the air. But it's okay now, ain't it? Couldn't be better, Lord, and I shortened the nights like you asked me to. I just can't see what's wrong this time, Mr. Rabbit. Well, Lord, if you'd hush up, I'll tell you. Now just slow down a minute, Mr. Rabbit. I'm just trying to see if my world is functioning all right. First world I ever made, and it wasn't no easy job. We understand that, Lord, the deer said. Yes, Lord, we understand that, the rabbit repeated, and we think you did a fine job, considering how you're an amateur and all that. However, there's a new animal down there. Oh, you must mean man, the Lord interrupted. Man? Uh-huh. An animal that walks on two legs and ain't got no hair, the deer wanted to know. That's him, the Lord said, and let me tell you, it was a hard job putting him together. I remember I started early one Monday morning. I'd had the idea tucked away in my head for a long time, so I figured it wouldn't take me more than a few hours to put him together. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Rabbit. Oh, Lord, we understand. We'd like to hear about it, but we just don't have the time today. Lord, while we're up here talking with you, that man animal is down there killing everything he can get his hands on. What was that? That's the truth, Lord. Now you know how we got things worked out among ourselves so that the deer know to stay away from the lions. And the groundhog looks out for the snake, and the fish try to stay out of the bear's way. It's a pretty good arrangement. We don't have to walk around being afraid of everybody else, but this man animal, and the rabbit, the deer, and the frog took turns telling God the entire story. After they finished, the Lord didn't say anything for a long while. He stared off into space and looked very sad. Well, he said finally, I think everything will work out all right. I thought man might have a little trouble getting adjusted to everything, but you take my word for it, everything will be okay. The rabbit, the deer, and the frog expressed some doubts, but after God reassured them several times, they went back and reported to the other animals. Things didn't get better, though. More and more of the man animals began to appear in the forest, and one evening the birds came home to find that some trees had been cut down, including the one they lived in. Soon the man animals had cleared a lot of the forest, and the animals moved to another forest. It wasn't long, though, before the man animals came to that forest and cut it down. And the animals had to move again. Everywhere the animals lived, the man animals came. They put airplanes in the air, and the hawk was sorry that he had not tried to kill the man animal when he had the chance. They put boats on the water and submarines in the sea. They built roads through the middle of mountains and laid pipes deep in the ground, and the groundhogs and all their relatives had to move. They built cities beside rivers and poured gallons of foul liquids into the rivers, and many fish died. The smoke from their cities filled the air, and no birds could live in the cities. They sprayed plants with liquids, and many animals died because there were no clean plants to eat. The animals moved to new forests, but the man animal was never far behind. Finally, the animals were tired of moving. Once again, the rabbit called a meeting, and all the animals came, even the hawk. They talked about it for several days. The bear suggested that they make war on the man animals, but after much discussion, they couldn't figure how they could get guns and tanks and airplanes. Eventually, the owl, who was the wisest of the animals, said, the only sensible thing we can do is to become man animals ourselves. That is the only way we will ever be as powerful as they are. You're right, the rabbit exclaimed instantly. The other animals agreed, and they quickly formed a delegation to go tell God the news. When they got to heaven the next morning, the Lord had already finished his morning coffee and was sitting on the porch reading the paper. Well, he said, putting the paper down, how you all doing? Lord, you got to turn us into man animals, the rabbit said immediately. He didn't have time for a whole lot of chit-chat that morning. Do what? That's right, Lord. That's the only way we can be as powerful as man animals is and protect ourselves. Otherwise, we don't stand a chance. The Lord thought it over for a long while. He didn't want to do it, but things hadn't worked out with man animal as well as he had hoped. In fact, things had turned out pretty bad. Something should have told him that it was going to turn out that way because he'd had such problems making man animal. Well, win a few and lose a few, thought the Lord. Okay, animals, tomorrow morning there will be a big pot of oil in the middle of the forest. Every animal who washes himself in that oil will become a man animal. The animals cheered and rushed back to tell the others, and when they heard the news, they were delirious with joy. When I get to be a man animal, said the bear, I'm going to get me a car. A red convertible with white seats. Tell me I ain't gonna be tough. Wait till you'll see me in one of them continental suits, the rabbit exclaimed. Won't be nobody as dap as me nowhere. All them women gonna look at me and say, who is that fine young daddy? All night long, the animals stayed up talking about what they were going to do when they became people. Some had already decided that they were going to form a company to buy land, because if anybody knew what land had oil and gold and silver and everything else on it, they sure did. The jaguar was already campaigning among the other animals to vote for him for president. They were making so much noise that the Lord couldn't help but hear them. He listened for a while and became very sad. He couldn't help but think that if they were acting this way now, he didn't want to imagine how they would act when they became people. And the world was in bad enough shape as it was. He was so depressed about it that he was thinking of going off and building another world. And as he listened to the animals talk about what they were going to do when they became people, he decided that the last thing the world needed was any more people. So he threw a thunderbolt down from heaven, and broke the pot of oil. And when the animals came upon it the next morning, there were just a few drops left in some of the cracked pieces. And while the other animals were looking at it in shock and amazement, the ape, the gorilla, the chimpanzee, and the monkey rushed over and washed their faces, hands, and feet in the few drops that remained. And that's why those animals look like people. Okay, that was a pretty good story, but the ending was rather dull. I mean, I just don't understand it. I don't get it. Anyway, that's all. Goodbye, bros.